Hello, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone. Our topics for tonight are end of Neocon Delusions, Trump and Gallant, and why Dems lost. Of course, everybody and his brother is discussing why Dems have lost. It was hard to avoid not getting into the act. So I hope you'll forgive me for getting into the act. Anyway, let's start off with the BRICS topic. The title of this piece is The BRICS Summit Should Mark the End of Neocon Delusions. This is by Jeff Sachs on November 3rd, 2024. And here's a picture of the heads of the BRICS. Or at least of the representative of the heads of the BRICS. I don't see Lula there, but the fellow on the right is the representative of Lula. Undoubtedly, BRICS leader's family photo. I don't think Lula thought that it was wise for him to come. Maybe some internal problems in Brazil. The recent BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia should mark the end of the Neocon Delusions, encapsulated in the subtitle of Zbigniew Brzezinski's 1997 book, The Global Chessboard, American Primacy and its Geostrategic Imperatives. Since the 1990s, the goal of American foreign policy has been, quote, primacy, unquote, also known as global hegemony. The U.S. methods of choice have been wars, regime change operations, and unilateral coercive measures, economic sanctions. Kazan brought together 35 countries with more than half the world population that reject the U.S. Bullying, that are not cowed by U.S. claims of hegemony. In the Kazan Declaration, the countries underscored, quote, the emergence of new centers of power, policymaking, and economic growth, which can pave the way for a more equitable, just, democratic, and balanced multipolar world order, unquote. They emphasized, quote, the need to adapt the current architecture of international relations to better reflect the contemporary realities, unquote, while declaring their, quote, commitment to multilateralism and upholding the international law, including the purposes and principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, okay, the UN, as its indispensable cornerstone, unquote. They took particular aim at the sanctions imposed by the U.S. and its allies, holding that, quote, such measures undermine the UN Charter, the multilateral trading system, the sustainable development and environmental agreements, unquote. Time has run out on the neocon delusions and the U.S. wars of choice, says Jeff Sachs. The neocon quest for global hegemony has deep historical roots in America's belief in its exceptionalism. 1630, John Winthrop invoked the Gospels in describing the Massachusetts Bay Colony as a, quote, city on the hill, unquote, declaring grandiosely that, quote, the eyes of all people are upon us, unquote. Now, John Winthrop, of course, was a Puritan. In the 19th century, America was guided by manifest destiny to conquer North America by displacing or exterminating the native peoples. In the course of World War II, Americans embraced the idea of the, quote, American century, unquote, that after the war, the U.S. would lead the world. The U.S. delusions of grandeur were supercharged with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991. Well, that was an abbreviated history from Jeffrey. He went all the way back to 1630 and suddenly, then the end of the war, and suddenly we find ourselves in 1991, at the end of 1991. With America's Cold War nemesis gone, the ascendant American neoconservatives conceived of a new world order in which the U.S. was the sole superpower and the policeman of the world. Their foreign policy instruments of choice were wars and regime change operations to overthrow governments they disliked. Following 9/11, the neocons planned to overthrow 7 governments in the Islamic world, starting with Iraq, then moving on to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. According to Wesley Clark, former Supreme Commander of NATO, the neocons expected the U.S. to prevail in these wars in 5 years. Yet now, more than 20 years on, the neocon instigated wars continue while the U.S. has achieved absolutely none of its hegemonic objectives. The neocons reasoned back in the 1990s that no country, a group of countries, would ever dare to stand up to U.S. power. Brzezinski, for example, argued in the grand chessboard that Russia would have no choice but to submit to the U.S.-led expansion of NATO and the geopolitical dictates of the U.S. and Russia, since there was no realistic prospect of Russia successfully forming an anti-hegemonic coalition with China, Iran, and others. As Brzezinski put it, quote, Russia's only real geostrategic option, the option that could give Russia a realistic international role and also maximize the opportunity of transforming and socially modernizing itself, is Europe. And not just any Europe, but the transatlantic Europe of the enlarging EU and NATO, unquote. The emphasis here was added by Jeffrey, and it's the Kindle edition of the Grand Chessboard on page 118. And Brzezinski was decisively wrong, and his misjudgment helped lead to the disaster of the war in Ukraine. Russia did not simply succumb to the U.S. plan to expand NATO to Ukraine as Brzezinski assumed it would. Russia said a firm no and was prepared to wage war to stop the U.S. Plans. Yes, Russia has said a firm no, but particularly in the person of one man, one leader, that is actually Vladimir Putin. He has been the dominant leader in Russia since the turn of the 21st century and a little before. As a result of the neocon miscalculations going on with the article vis-a-vis Ukraine, Russia is now prevailing on the battlefield, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are dead. By all accounts, at least 600,000 are dead. I added that. Nor, and this is the plain message from Kazan, did U.S. sanctions and diplomatic pressures isolate Russia in the least. In response to pervasive U.S. Bullying, an anti-hegemonic counterweight has emerged. Simply put, the majority of the world does not want or accept but U.S. hegemony and is prepared to face it down rather than submit to its dictates. Nor does the U.S. anymore possess the economic, financial, or military power to enforce its will, if it ever did. The countries that assembled in Kazan represent a clear majority of the world's population. The 9 BRICS members: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa as the original 5, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. In addition to the delegations of 27 aspiring members, constitute 57% of the world's population, 47% of the world's output, measured at purchasing power adjusted prices. So that means the world's GDP when it's measured using purchasing power parity prices. The U.S., by contrast, constitutes 4.1 of the world population, 15% of the world output, and in the U.S. allies, and the population share of the U.S. alliance is around 15% of the global population. The BRICS will gain in relative economic weight, technological prowess, and military strength in the years ahead. The combined GDP of the BRICS countries is growing at around 5% per annum, while the combined GDP of the U.S. and its allies in Europe and Asia Pacific is growing at around 2% per annum. Even with their growing clout, however, the BRICS can't replace the U.S. as a new global hegemon. They simply lack the military, financial, and technological power to defeat the U.S. or even to threaten its vital interests. The BRICS are in practice calling for a new and realistic type of multipolarity, not an alternative hegemony in which they are in charge. American strategists should heed the ultimately positive message coming from Kazan. Not only has the neocon quest for global hegemony failed, it has been a costly disaster for the U.S. and the world, leading to bloody and pointless wars, economic shocks, mass displacements of population, and rising threats of nuclear confrontation. A more inclusive and equitable multipolar world order offers a promising path out of the current out of the morass, one that can benefit the U.S. and its allies, as well as the nations that met in Kazan. The rise of BRICS is therefore not merely a rebuke, to the U.S., but also a potential opening for a far more peaceful and secure world order. The multipolar world order envisioned by the BRICS can be a boon for all countries, including the United States. Time has run out on the Neocon delusions and the U.S. wars of choice. The moment has arrived for a renewed diplomacy to end the conflicts raging around the world. This is republished from Common Dreams by permission of the author, or representative. I think this article is at bottom a very hopeful one. I think the analysis is accurate, but I certainly think that from a normative point of view, the time has arrived for a renewed diplomacy to end the conflicts that are raging around the world. But I also think whether that becomes the future or not very much depends on the United States and whether it desires to withdraw from its use of military force and sanctions, and whether the United States is willing to use diplomacy in order to resolve the conflicts. I don't know how the Trump administration is going to view that. I think I know that they will use diplomacy to end the war, in Ukraine. But the $64 trillion question is, will they try to use it in order to end the conflicts in West Asia and in East Asia? That we don't know, but we can certainly hope. And we can keep each other informed as well. So I'm going to stop sharing this and take a look at who's here. Steve Day is here. Hi, Steve Day. And Dee is here. Hello, Dee. I'll be joining you tonight, by the way, after this is over. So looking forward to a long night here tonight. Hello, Evelina. How are you? So now I'll go to our second topic for the night. Guys, this article, Trump's Triumph and the Firing of Yoav Gallant. This is by Mike Whitney on November 6, 2004. And I picked this up at uns.com, the UNS review. Here's a photo. It's of a billboard in Israel. Congratulations, Trump. Make Israel great. And Mike asked, why was Trump allowed to win, the election? Well, that's interesting. So Mike Whitney thinks that the deep state has such control that it allowed Trump to win, the election, that it could have blocked him if it wanted to. The article goes on. We know what happens when the deep state does not get the outcome it wants. All hell breaks loose, just like it did following the 2016 elections. Try to remember what that was like. Try to remember the legal challenges and lawsuits, the hectoring and name-calling, the spurious allegations of voter fraud and of Russian meddling, and the overall discrediting of the electoral process. Try to recall the street protests, the angry anti-fascist mobs, scuffling with cops, and the relentless outbursts of rage directed at the, quote, new Hitler, unquote. But do you remember that? Actually, my memory of that is not as good as it is of the disorders that followed the 2020 elections. And I don't believe that those disorders were caused by the deep state, but who knows, maybe they were. Anyway, Mike Whitney says, that's what happens when the deep state does not get its way. Have you noticed that nothing similar to that display of manufactured rage has taken place in 2024? Have you noticed that the liberal media has been calling for calm and unity and that it's almost impossible to find a belligerent or hostile article aimed at Trump? Isn't this a case of the, quote, dog that didn't bark, unquote, a case in which a skeptical person should assume foul play not from what he hears, but from what he doesn't hear? Indeed, the reason the election results were, quote, free and fair, unquote, is not because the intel community has stopped its rigging of elections, but because no rigging was required. They wanted Trump to win because Trump was, quote, their man, unquote. Before I explain what I mean by that, allow me to share an email I sent to a friend on Monday, the day before the election. Trump's going to win. The deep state needs a popular president to recruit red state teenagers to fight a war with Iran. Harris doesn't have that kind of appeal, unquote. Doesn't this help to explain why the media hasn't gone bonkers over the Trump victory and pillory him as a racist, fascist, homophobe, as they typically do? I guess I have to ask, isn't he a racist, fascist, homophobe? As it happens, the deep state, which unconditionally supports the state of Israel, needs Donald Trump. They need a charismatic, populist firebrand to boost recruitment and spearhead the rush to war. Harris can't do that. Harris had trouble attracting even 100 supporters to her rallies. Gee, that's a surprise to me. I thought I saw many photos of supporters of Harris at her rallies, including 75,000 of them in Washington, D.C., on the ellipse. I don't think there was a lot of trouble recruiting those supporters to her rallies. She had a pretty decent crowd also who came to her concession speech at Howard University. I noticed that too. I was surprised to find that there were hundreds of supporters there. No, this is a task for a leader that is trusted, admired, and loved. This is a task for a man who has credibility with the red state young men who traditionally fight our wars. This is a job for Trump. And here's a tweet from the Prime Minister of Israel at Israeli PM. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, dear Donald and Melania Trump, congratulations on history's greatest comeback. Your historic return to the White House offers a new beginning for America and a powerful recommitment to the great alliance between Israel and America. That was tweeted out at 2:53 a.m. on November 6th, 2024. And the tweet got 874K views on the platform of Elon Musk, otherwise known as X. I have to say, in reading that particular tweet, that I don't see a great alliance between Israel, and America. The surprising thing is they have never concluded a great alliance. There is no written document that states the reality, of this alliance. It's just a relationship that is renewed from presidency to presidency. Whether it makes any sense or not, going on. That doesn't mean that the deep state has abandoned its pro-censorship, pro-surveillance, anti-civil liberties agenda. It hasn't. I completely agree with that. It just means that their overall priorities have shifted to more pressing issues, like the Iranian ballistic missile attack on Israel, which could happen at any time. I know, I've been looking for that. keep looking for it. Trump will not only be required to respond to that attack, he will also be asked to deploy U.S. troops to counter the Iranian threat. Given Trump's record of sycophancy to Israel, as well as the $100 million his campaign was gifted by Zionist donors, I think that money was gifted actually, by Miriam Adelson. I think there will probably be more gifts in excess of $100 million by other donors who were Zionists. Anyway, Mike says, we expect he will comply. No president has demonstrated more unwavering loyalty to Israel than Donald J. Trump. Do you have any idea of how highly regarded Trump is in Israel? Check out this extraordinary clip of two TV anchors downing shots of whiskey on air in celebration of the Trump victory. Here's a tweet from Two-Face. It says, God bless America and people of Israel. Israeli TV celebrates Trump's victory on air. Trump is no stranger to sporting a kippah. Actually a kippah. And generally maintains sound relations with Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East. Whenever I encounter Israel and I see the word democracy, I feel like putting it in scare quotes. I'm not going to play this video. The caption of it is, friends, God bless America and the people of Israel. Chai. What Chai means here is to life. Can you imagine what the reaction would be if pundits in Moscow performed a similar toast on national TV? Here's another must-see display of emotion by an infantryman blasting a civilian enclave in Gaza while bellowing, quote, God bless Israel and God bless the USA. And there's a tweet there from Ian Miles Bachung. Israeli soldiers are celebrating the victory of Donald Trump. I won't play that one either. And here's a TV game show host leading an audience in a traditional song of celebration to the large photo of Trump on a screen behind him. And the tweet is, the Israeli media is celebrating Trump's victory. Israel absolutely loves Donald Trump. It is clear that Trump is regarded by many Israelis as an American messiah who will deploy his legions of young men to the Middle East to smite Israel's enemies and help the Jewish state emerge as the regional hegemon. That's the hope, at least. The reality may be far different, but the point we're trying to make is that Trump's utility to Israel may have been a critical factor in the deep state's approach to the 2024 presidential elections. Of course, that is just my own conspiratorial point of view, says Mike Whitney. Guess who else supports Donald Trump? The ADL put forward a statement. ADL congratulates President Trump, VP-elect Vance, and all candidates who won last night. The ADL is the Anti-Defamation League, of course. Now, on to Gallant. The surprise sacking of Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is significant for many reasons, none of which have been covered in the mainstream media. Netanyahu justified the action in the statement he delivered on Tuesday. In the midst of a war, more than ever, full trust is required between the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister. Unfortunately, although in the first few months of the campaign there was such trust and very fruitful work, over the last few months this trust has cracked between myself and the Defense Minister. This is nonsense. There was, quote, no crisis of trust, unquote, between Netanyahu and Gallant. The defense minister was fired because he objected to the improvisational and idiotic way the war was being conducted. As a military man, he wanted to see the implementation of a coherent strategy that clearly articulated the objectives of the mission and manner in which those goals could be realistically achieved. But as anyone who has watched this bloody fiasco unfold, it's clear that there is no battle plan, no strategy, and no endgame. Netanyahu has been flying by the seat of his pants from the get-go while keeping the bulk of the population on his side with regular eye-popping tactical triumphs like the exploding pages or the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. Bibi operates on the theory that war is not a coercive way to achieve objectives, but a series of oddball events aimed at garnering public support. Sacking Gallant merely confirms that Netanyahu intends to continue in the same suicidal vein, embroiling Israel in more and more conflicts for which there is no clear definition of victory and no plan for ending the hostilities. These are truly the forever wars. I think that's a great summation by Mike Whitney. Don't get me wrong. Gallant is not a, quote, good guy, unquote, by any stretch of the imagination. He's just slightly more rational than the loonies that are fast becoming the majority of Bibi's war cabinet. This is an excerpt from an article at the Times of Israel. I'll quote again. An official close to the Prime Minister tells the Times of Israel that Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was fired for professional reasons and not because of coalition politics. Quote again, the official speaking on condition of anonymity says that Gallant advocated a diplomatic solution in Lebanon 6 months ago that would not have diminished Hezbollah's capabilities and opposed the killing of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah until the IDF backed the move. On Gaza, claims the official, Gallant resisted the IDF going into Rafah because of American pressure and fought against Netanyahu's and most of the cabinet's position on the need to remain on the Philadelphia corridor. Official close to Netanyahu claims Gallant fired for professional reasons. And that quote was from the Times of Israel. Let's summarize. 1. Gallant advocated a diplomatic solution in Lebanon 6 months ago. 2. Opposed the killing of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Gallant resisted the IDF going into Rafah. And 4. And fought against Netanyahu's position on the need to remain on the Philadelphia corridor. On these issues, Gallant's views closely align with the views of the majority of people around the world who oppose Israel's provocations and escalation. What does this tell us? It tells us that Gallant opposed unnecessary, pointless bloodshed that achieved no strategic purpose and that only served to undermine Israel's security. It shows that the defense minister wanted Israel's operations to comply with conventional military theory that acknowledged Israel's diminishing ability to carry on a multi-front campaign. It shows that his views on warfare were fundamentally different than those of Netanyahu, who believes that the primary objective of armed conflict is to inflict pain on one's enemy. It tells us that Gallant was increasingly concerned about the direction of the war and how Israel had grossly overestimated its military capability. Once again, we're not saying Gallant is a virtuous person. Quite the contrary, the man is a viper. Even so, his approach made some sense from a military point of view. The fact that he's been replaced by another messianic lunatic who enthusiastically supports the blocking of food and medicine to starving Palestinians while never articulating a vision for ending the hostilities tells you that the Israeli leadership has no idea of the trouble they are in. Depending upon the ferocity of Iran's upcoming missile attack, Israel could be facing an existential crisis that the U.S. will be unable to change. Here's a short clip of John Mearsheimer explaining how Israel is presently mired in numerous wars it has no way of winning. Quote from Mearsheimer, let's talk about the three conflicts. The one in Gaza the conflict with Hezbollah, and the conflict with Iran. Israel has three goals in Gaza. One, to decisively defeat Hamas. Two, to get the hostages back. Three, to ethnically cleanse Gaza. They have achieved none of these. Furthermore, they're stuck in Gaza. They left Gaza in 2005 because it was a hornet's nest, and now they're back in there because they haven't defeated Hamas. With regard to Hezbollah, they tried to decapitate the leadership. They were successful, but it made no difference, so they went on to kill a huge number of civilians in Beirut. That didn't work. So they invaded on the ground, and they're getting clobbered in southern Lebanon. And remember, the reason they invaded was to stop the rocket fire into Israel, but they haven't stopped the rocket fire, and they haven't succeeded against Hezbollah, and they won't succeed against Hezbollah. Perhaps eventually some negotiated settlement might be worked out, who knows? But the idea that their military strategy has worked, it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked against Hezbollah, and it hasn't worked against Hamas. And against Iran, Iran is still capable of sending large numbers of ballistic missiles into Israel. Mearsheimer explains how Israel's attack on Iran was a failure. The Israelis do not have escalation dominance over Iran, and Israel does not have escalation dominance over Hezbollah. Hezbollah is still firing rockets and missiles into Israel, yes, right up to this very day. And by the way, the Houthis are now firing missiles into Israel too. The conventional wisdom in the West is that Israel is on a roll, or that Israel is in the driver's seat, is simply wrong. And if you look at what is happening in Gaza, and what is happening with Hezbollah, and what is happening with Iran, Israel is in a lot of trouble. Mearsheimer explains the revolution in missile technology that has rendered Israel's air power obsolete. Netanyahu and his lieutenants failed to understand that Israel can no longer defend against Iranian ballistic missiles. This is an interview with John Mearsheimer at Unheard. What is the connection between Mearsheimer's analysis and Gallant's firing? Gallant's dismissal is linked to, quote, a harshly worded missive to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, warning that Israel's war efforts had become aimless and needed to be refocused. According to the Times of Israel, quote, in the communique, Gallant argued that Israel was fighting according to an, quote, outdated compass, unquote, that Jerusalem needed to revise its official war aims initially set following the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack. Quote again, significant developments in the war, especially Israel and Iran, trading direct blows, raised the necessity of holding a discussion and updating the war's goals with a comprehensive look at the areas of fighting and the interconnections between them. Gallant reportedly wrote, while Israel initially set its war goals as the destruction of the Hamas terror group and the return of hostages taken during the onslaught of southern Israel over a year ago, the fighting has expanded significantly due to attacks by Iranian proxies and Iran itself, with Israel saying it is actually fighting a seven-front war. Quote again, Israel updated its goals to include the return of northern residents to their homes before sharply intensifying attacks on the Hezbollah terror group in Lebanon last month. Of course, this is a quote. I'm not saying Hezbollah is a terror group. That's what the quote says. Quote again, Gallant was said to advocate adding the following war aims in the West Bank, quote, preventing an outbreak of violence by thwarting terrorism, unquote. In Iran, quote, deterrence and keeping Iran out of the war, unquote, and in Gaza, quote, establishing a reality with no military threat, preventing the growth of terror capabilities, return of all the hostages, and promotion of an alternative to the Hamas government, unquote. And quote again, Gallant's coalition, Gallant's opposition to Israeli rule of Gaza and his support for a hostage ceasefire deal there have put him at odds with the coalition's far-right flank, further stressing already frayed ties with the cabinet. The Gallant said to tell Netanyahu management of war directionless, goals need updating. This is from the Times of Israel. Unquote. Can you see what's going on? Can you understand how serious this is? Asks Mike Whitney. Gallant opposed the war with Iran, so he was sacked. Now the crazies are running the asylum and think that Uncle Sam is going to come to the rescue when they get their butts kicked. This may be the most dangerous situation humanity has ever faced. The future of life on the planet is being decided by fanatical messianic zealots whose grasp of reality is greatly in doubt and who believe that any act of violence they inflict on their neighbors is blessed by Almighty God. And now they want Trump to join their ham-brained war on Iran so they can light up the entire region like a Roman candle and bring on the end times. In the words of Nancy Reagan, Trump should, quote, just say no, unquote. So I thought that was a pretty good piece. Of course, I disagree with a lot of it in terms of the emphasis and things like that, but it was certainly very well written, and it's worth thinking about, I think. So that's why I chose it for this stream. I will now return to your comments and see what you have to say. Steve Day says. So Dee says, hello, everyone. And she says she shared on Facebook and X. Thank you very much, Dee. Steve Day says, speaking of crack, evil is, Times of Israel is a good fish wrapper. And Lana, who is here, thank you, Lana, says, please hit, the like button. Yes, please do hit, the like button. Also hit the share, and if you haven't subscribed, the subscribe button is also. I promised Bonnie I would say something tonight, about my background, and I clean forgot to do it. Okay. I'm a PhD in comparative politics, and international relations from Michigan State University in 1965. I have also studied a lot of domestic politics and think I am pretty well known in that area as well. In my later years, I learned quite a bit, of knowledge management, and I've written books in that area. I also have written books that would probably be described as political economics, using the MMT approach. Altogether, with books of all kinds, I've written 11 books and hundreds of articles, over the years. I'm now going to turn to what basically will be the second half of this stream, and that's going to be concerned with domestic politics in the United States, and we'll address the question of why the Dems actually lost. Now, of course, I was listening to various breakdowns of how the voting went and who voted for whom. Of course, the voting itself was a complete surprise, unanticipated by the polls, which were off by a terrible amount this year. They really were way, way off. They kind of stunk, in fact. For example, Ann Seltzer's poll, in Iowa, turned out in the end to be 17 points off. She predicted about 2 days before the election that Kamala was going to win by 3 points, and Trump won in Iowa by 14 points. So she was 17 points off. she's considered just about the number one pollster in the whole country, and she was 17 points off. Now, there were people who had been polling Texas, by the way, and they saw before the election Trump with a 4 or 5 point lead, and thought, that maybe Kamala had a chance to catch up if the polls were overestimating the support of Trump. And if I remember correctly, Trump ended up winning Texas by 18 points. So that was another 13-point error. Okay. There was a great error in Florida also, where he won by 14 points, which was an improvement of an improvement of 11 points over his performance in 2020. And that was unpredicted by the polls also. And in state after state after state, the margins were unpredicted by the polls. And they were also unpredicted by the early voting and by the other indicators of campaign strength, specifically ground games, the funding advantages, which the Democrats had, the enthusiasm of one's crowds, the size of one's crowds. Most of the really, really large crowds in this election were for Kamala and not for Trump, and that got increasingly clear as the campaign went on. You saw people leaving Trump's rallies early, and him getting angry at what was happening. Now, you didn't see any of that with respect to Kamala, of course. So it was thought that over the last few days that the election was going her way. It turned out that was completely opposite. People were speculating that she was going to get all the swing states, and Trump ended up getting all the swing states. I don't know what happened actually to Nevada in the end. Last time I looked, it was still close. Trump was ahead, but it was still possible for her to catch up there. And she was closing in that state. I don't know what the final result was. I do know that the senatorial race there still is undecided, and that Jackie Rosen is calling for funds so that every vote can be counted and asking for contributions. Bob Casey in Pennsylvania is asking for contributions also for the same thing. So a number of the Democratic losses gained the Senate are, I guess the counting is not completely over. But it looks like the Republicans picked up, they picked up a seat in West Virginia. Looks like they picked up Sherry Brown's seat in Ohio. Looks like they picked up John Tester's in the Montana race. So they picked up at least 3 seats, but the issue wasn't completely decided in Michigan yet, in Wisconsin, in Arizona. Now, there's still a number of races that were outstanding. I think the Republicans will end up picking up 4 seats, something like that, and will probably end up with a lead of something like 52 to 48. But the issue is, again, why did these results actually occur? So one of the big factors in their occurring is Hispanics, and particularly Puerto Rican men, were much more in favor of Trump than any of the polls seem to indicate. There were big, big errors in that particular group. And big, big errors also throughout working class voters. It was expected working class voters would go for Trump, but they went for Trump in much larger numbers than were expected, as did non-college educated people in general, uh, and college educated people too in certain states. In Georgia, a lot of the college educated people, were simply abandoning the Democrats. Anyway, I thought about all this. I thought about what happened with the segments. Uh, the Ann Seltzer poll in Iowa had indicated that we should be watching on election night for senior women who were going for Kamala and not for Trump. And for women in general, there was supposedly an enormous gender gap. Iowa is not a typical state. It's not a typical state because it has a very low minority population. It's mostly a population, of white people, and so it had the disadvantage as a projection mechanism of trying to project what was found there to the rest of the country, because the ethnic and racial makeup of Iowa was very different. And that's one thing that happened on election day. Kamala did underperform with respect to blacks, but not by much. She was only 1 point behind where Joe Biden was in 2020. But Joe Biden didn't do very well among blacks. No, he was nowhere near, for example, Obama's performances. In other words, Obama had something like 93% of the black vote, or 94% of the black vote, or 95% of the black vote. I forget exactly where it was, but it was at that particular level. Joe Biden came in at 87. So he lost a good portion of the black vote, or Trump got a good portion of the black vote compared to what was normal, or compared even to Hillary. But Kamala did even less well at roughly 86% of the black vote. But when it came to the Hispanic vote, that went much more heavily for Trump than anybody thought. But even in terms of how those groups were breaking, overall, it was the case that the number of people who voted in 2024 was way, way off what happened in 2020. So many more people stayed home. Joe Biden's popular vote total in 2020 was 81 million votes. Donald Trump's vote total, if I recall correctly, was 73 million votes. That's 154 million votes. In 2024, at last counts that I saw, Trump was at something like 71.6 million votes. He's probably got more now, because there were more votes in California and other states to come in yet. But he hadn't gotten near the 73 million yet. He might have gotten near that. But there's a good chance that he got less total votes in 2024 than he got in 2023 when he lost the election. And Kamala got about 67 million votes compared to Biden's 81 million votes. 14 million less than Biden got. Where did those 14 million votes go? Well, some of them were Hispanic votes that went to Trump, certainly. But also, it's obvious that most of them just stayed home, couldn't be bothered to vote, either for Trump or for Kamala. Couldn't be bothered to vote. The total for both sides was, let's say, 72 million for Trump and 67 million for Kamala. What is that? 139 million, something like that. Don't know if I added completely correctly there. But Kamala had 14 million less, and Trump had about 1.5 million less than his total of 2020. That's 15.5 million votes less. They either went for third parties, but their totals were minuscule, so most of them stayed home. And more than that, stayed home, because we know there were millions of new voters in this election who did not stay home. We knew that from the early vote and from the registration figures. So the 14 million votes who stayed home were mostly from old voters who, the 15.5 million who stayed home were mostly from old voters, not from the new voters. So why did they stay home? Evelina says, what percent of the population voted at all? Does anyone know? Less than half. Yeah, I think it was less than half. So why did they stay home? Why did they stay away from Kamala? Okay, especially. And the answer, I think there are a couple answers why they stayed home. One answer, of course, is that she was campaigning only for 3.5 months. And even though she was the vice president, she was never well known because she wasn't a highly visible vice president. And by the way, she came into the race without a platform. She didn't have a platform until must have been 3 or 4 weeks into the campaign before she got a platform. And it was a very spare platform, only a few pages. It didn't at all compare to Bernie Sanders' platform in 2020, which was, I don't know, pages and pages and pages and pages. I forget, it was just, it was not ending. By the way, I think what Kamala should have done in this campaign, when she was starting off in this campaign, what I think would have allowed her to win, it would have been on the first day to copy Bernie Sanders' platform 2020 word for word, and she should have made a call to Bernie Sanders and asked him to run as a vice presidential candidate. Now, I'm not criticizing Tim Walz. I think he was a fine candidate, okay, in many ways. But the coupling of Bernie Sanders' platform and getting Bernie to run as your vice president would have sent a message. It would have sent a message to the have-nots, to working class people all across the country. That message would have been, I care about you. I care about you. I am embracing Bernie, who you know cared about you then and cares about you now. And then maybe so many people wouldn't have stayed home. Maybe she would have made up those 5 million votes. In other words, she's behind Trump by about 5.5 million votes, okay, right now. I think, something like that. So I think she should have done that. I think she should have won on an explicit platform that offered Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, child tax credits, paid sick leave, maybe most important of all, a federal job guarantee, because you need people to give people in red states something to vote for. You want Texas or Florida, you have to cut into Trump's margins in the rural areas, deeply cut in to rural areas. A federal job guarantee at a cost-adjusted living wage, bringing jobs to where the people are all over the country. That's something the rural areas would eat up. Having Bernie as your vice presidential candidate would have gotten people to trust you, because people trusted Bernie. Now, I know he lost a lot of trust because he withdrew in 2020. But he's been working since then. He's still trying to defend people's interests since then. People know that Bernie's still on their side. She should have embraced that. I think she lost because she did not embrace that kind of platform and those kinds of themes, in her campaign. She spent too much time discussing the democracy crisis and Trump's his fascism. Of course, you have to campaign some on that, but you have to give people something to vote for, not simply to vote against. Now, I had this campaign running for a long time, the Dump the Corruption campaign. That was about voting against people. I left it to candidates that didn't take big money to make the positive case for themselves. In the Dump the Corruption campaign, it's not the purpose of that campaign to pick certain people. It's the purpose of that campaign to pick certain people to boot out of office. But Kamala was running for office, so she had to give people reasons to vote for her. Now, the reproductive rights stuff, that was a reason to vote for her. And that was powerful. And I don't want to over-exaggerate this, because it was a close election. Trump swept all the battleground states, yes. But they were swept by relatively small margins, generally speaking. It was still a close election. That at last count, he only had 291 electoral votes, and she had something like 226 electoral votes. If she had gotten those 3 blue wall states, she still would have won. So, I'm not saying she completely tanked in the election. In other words, it wasn't like a landslide, or a blowout. People seem to be looking at it like that. But it wasn't like that. I mean, if you want to see a blowout, go back to Reagan in 84, or to Lyndon Johnson in 64, or to Nixon in 72, or to Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. Those are the landslides. Those are the blowouts. Even Obama in 2008 had only 365 electoral votes. In all these other cases we're talking about, the number of electoral votes was over 500 out of the 538. That's a landslide. This was not a landslide for Trump. It wasn't even as decisive a victory as Biden had in 2020 or Trump had in 2016. Of course, Trump in this case, at least had a majority of the popular vote for a change. It's the first time he got that. So this was a more legitimate victory than his victory in 2016. And of course was better than his loss of both the electoral vote and the popular vote in 2020. But note again, He didn't even get as many popular votes this time. He got the majority of the popular votes, but his popular vote total was lower in 2024 than it was in 2020, unless lately he's caught up to the 2020 total. Okay. So why do I think they lost? I think they lost because they didn't give the working class and the lower middle class, the people who were struggling over the high prices that were caused by the inflation. Now, the inflation is gone now, of course, but the high prices are not. People are still suffering with the high prices because there hasn't been any deflation to cut them back. Oh, by the way, I was in the grocery store just yesterday. I was buying some lamb shanks for our Thanksgiving dinner. We have a weird Thanksgiving dinner, okay, with, lamb shanks. So I went to Wegmans to buy the lamb shanks. Last year, they were $18 in some odd. This year, they were $15 in some odd. So the lamb shanks deflated. They deflated. I was pleased. I walked out. I told Bonnie, I said, hey, there was some disinflation in lamb shanks. Fantastic. Anyway, she ran a campaign that did not address the economic needs of people. And those people were unhappy with the economic performance of the Biden administration. And you can compare it to previous Democratic administrations all you want. You can say it was more progressive than this or more progressive than that. But this comparative stuff is bullshit. You always have to address whether what they've done is enough to make people feel good, to make people able to answer the question, are you feeling better than you felt 4 years ago? Nobody was feeling that way. Why not? Because of the inflation, which was pressuring household budgets. Frankly, it's pressuring my own household budget. Or that is the higher prices are, not the inflation anymore. Thank God the inflation has gone back into the 2% range. So it's not bad. In other words, I'm glad it's not going up anymore. But we need some federal pressure against price gouging to take it down so people are not suffering. But think about what would have happened in this particular election. Let's think about something counterfactual. What if Joe Biden, at the beginning of his administration, what if Joe Biden had kept his promise and delivered $2,000 stimulus checks? What if he had faced down the parliamentarian in the Senate and Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema and gotten the minimum wage of $15 an hour passed? For 4 years now, since Biden came into office, he failed to make good on a platform promise of the Democratic Party that they would raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. How many of the Hispanic workers in this country are working at $7.25 an hour and have to work 2 or 3 jobs? How many of them have to do that? How many of them are suffering in that way? How many of the working class who voted for Trump was making $1/2 $15 an hour, or 2/3 of $15 an hour, or 60% of $15 an hour. And of course, with the inflation, $15 an hour wasn't near enough either. You needed an average of $25 an hour to make do. Even if it was at $15 an hour, they still would have had to work 2 jobs in order to keep things together. That's certainly true. But how many of them were still working at $7.25 an hour? And Biden and Harris are telling him times were good, that they did a good job economically. Come on. I mean, get real. What if Biden had done that? And what if he hadn't abandoned but had pushed through the American Family Plan in his first year? Okay. And notice, the more you do initially, the more you can do. If you keep your promise on $2,000 stimulus, people feel a lot better about you than if you give them only $1,400. If you give them $1,400, say you got $2,000 because Trump gave you $6,000, then how does that make you feel? I'll tell you how it made me feel. It made me feel like goddamn Joe Biden owed me $600. That's the way it made me feel. And pronouncements from AOC that I got $2,000 didn't make me feel one bit better. In fact, it made me feel even angry. I mean, I don't need bologna sausage arguments of that kind. He welched on his promise of $2,000 within less than a month after he made the promise. And then he welched on the $15 an hour. What if he had come through with both of those things? Then, when he went to the well for the American Family Plan, he might have gotten it onto the floor and voted for. Once a president does popular things, they build a wave, and they can ride a wave, and they can get the people who are skeptical about what they're doing to vote for them, especially when they're people in their own party. What you do is you get floor votes in Congress and subject people like Sinema and Manchin and some of the other conservatives, you subject them to the floor votes, make them go on record. You embarrass them. Then you get a lot more of those votes through. Remember, in the first 2 years, the Democrats had a trifecta. They could have pushed through much more than they pushed through. If they had done it, guess what? They might not have lost in 2022. So maybe Biden would have had 4 years to legislate stuff. And then what? Then comes the election of 2024, and the same scenario, with Harris suddenly parachuting in at the end to replace Biden. And people feel a lot better about the Biden administration and a lot better about Harris because she was part of the Biden administration. And by the way, what if the jerk had never gotten involved in Ukraine? What if he took calls from Putin at the end of 2021 and created a new security framework instead of pushing Putin to the wall and getting the war started in February of 2024? Not only would he have spent much less than the $130 billion we spent on that war, but he also would have looked very good making peace with Russia. Instead, Putin was for it. He would have done it. He was trying to stop the war, to get to talk to Biden. Biden wouldn't even talk to him. That was the trigger event that caused him to invade. It wasn't all the cause, of course, because we'd been surrounding Russia for years and years and years before that, and all the administrations were party to do that, Trump's too. But Biden's was much more aggressive in pushing things. Well, what if Biden hadn't done that? And what if Biden had exerted control over Israel after October 7th? I mean, what if on October 14th, he had said to Netanyahu, hey, this has gone far enough now. You have your retaliation. You've killed hundreds more people, maybe even by then 1,000 or 2,000 more people than were killed of your people on October 7th. You need to pull back and negotiate a ceasefire. And if you don't do it, I'm withholding any further arms shipments from you. What if he had done that? And what if Kamala had run on a platform of giving things to the people who were struggling? In fact, what if Biden had even done a little more? Like, let's say it's 2023 and the end of 2022, and the inflation is there, and people are suffering from that inflation. And Biden, having gotten popular because he passed, the American Family Plan, okay, and also, the American Infrastructure Plan, okay, as well as the Recovery Plan. Okay, what if he then says, okay, and remember, this is 2022, he still has control of Congress. He says, oh, this inflation is really terrible. I'm going to try to stop it by stopping the price gouging. But in addition to that, in addition to trying to stop the price gouging, I'm going to provide another $2,000 check, stimulus check, to compensate for you for the greater household costs you've had since the inflation. I'm going to give you $2,000 to compensate for that. There are many reasons why Kamala lost, but the basic reasons were the record of the Biden administration in supporting people who needed support was not very good. By the way, I have to mention again, what if Biden, in the late spring of 2021, had passed the federal job guarantee program? What then? Okay, now I'm going to quickly go through, a number of articles. Okay, but you get my point. They didn't act like Democrats. They did not run like Democrats. They weren't real Democrats. They were these neoliberal fools. That's why they lost, the election of 2024. Because people were angry at them. Certain groups were angry at them. They needed the support of these votes. Anything she offers came with caveats. Yeah, I agree. Came with caveats. The point is, they didn't run like Democrats. They haven't run like Democrats for a long time. They've run like Republican lights for a long time. And she ran like Republican light again. Then the last 2 or 3 weeks of campaigning, all she was doing, was running around with Republicans who were endorsing her, announcing their support of her, as if her Democratic constituencies cared a damn about that. What did working people working 2 or 3 jobs care about that? Why would they care that she was running around with Liz Cheney? Or why would they care she was running around with Oprah or various kinds of celebrities? Or why would they care that she was getting support from Beyonce? I mean, this is all really very easy to understand. So let's get some articles quickly. I won't have time to read these articles. I'm just going to point out some key things. The first of these is from Bernie Sanders. Not from Bernie Sanders, actually. It's an article in Common Dreams about a statement on Twitter by Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders forcefully called out the leadership of the Democratic Party for losing the White House and at least one chamber of Congress to Republicans. Yeah, they might have lost two because it's not clear they took the House. They had a narrow path, okay, to get the House. When last I looked, actually the Republicans had a better chance to get the House too, as well as the Senate. Bernie said, quote, "It should come as no great surprise that the Democratic Party, which has abandoned working class people, would find that the working class people has abandoned them," he said in the statement. "First it was the white working class, now it is Latino and black workers as well," unquote. He's dead right? Quote, "While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry or want change," said the senator, who decisively won his re-election on Tuesday as Democrats reclaimed the upper chamber, quote, "and they're right," unquote. So let's see if there's anything else from this article from Common Dreams I want to pick up. This article was written by Jessica Corbett, November 6, 2024. After seeking the Democratic presidential nomination 2016 and 2020, Sanders spent this cycle campaigning for Harris, warning of Republican President-elect Donald Trump's return, blasting billionaire involvement in U.S. politics, and urging Democrats to better serve working people. I dare say if they had, she would have had no trouble in defeating Trump in this election, even given the fact that she only had a campaign of 3.5 months. Another quote from Bernie: "Will the big-moneyed interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how we can take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy, which has so much economic and political power?" Unquote, he asked. Quote, "Probably not," unquote. And quote again, "In the coming weeks and months, those of us concerned about grassroots democracy and economic justice need to have some very serious political discussions," unquote. Sanders concluded, quote, "Stay tuned," unquote. Okay, so that's all that I'm going to cover from what Bernie said. He's basically saying in less detail than I said what I said, right? It's there. I want to now share the screen. This is another article from Common Dreams. I think I shared the wrong article. What I wanted to share was this one. I will share the one I just put up in a minute, but I wanted to share here. This is by Les Leopold, who's an old union guy. Here's a picture of Hickory Grant, a machinist and a member of the Forks Town Council, unfurls a Trump flag at his workshop in Forks, Washington, on October 15, 2024, in McClellan County in the state of Washington. He might as well be some other machinist unfurling a flag in Elliott County, Kentucky. Why did the Democrats lose? Because they gave up on the working class 40 years ago. It really hurts to have called this one, so I wanted to be wrong. I feel like I've been in a brawl, a massive street fight where the punches are words and concepts instead of fists. I got clobbered while trying as hard as possible to warn the Democrats they're losing the working class and they absolutely must change course. It should have been obvious that the Democrats could not cuddle up to Wall Street and then pretend that the, quote, opportunity society, unquote, would help working people emerge from 40 years of mass layoffs and stagnant wages. It was so clear the Democrats would be viewed as members and defenders of the elite establishment that rules over both the economy and government that Trump would be seen as the disruptor, the friend of the working class. It really hurts to have called this one I so wanted to be wrong. Okay, so Les Leopold has a book on how the Democratic Party lost to the working class. Okay, it looks like, okay, a very good book. Okay, I recommend it. The book also refutes the widely shared notion about the, quote, deplorable white working class. It provides conclusive data that shows these workers actually have become more liberal, not illiberal, on divisive social issues over the past several decades. Democrats assumed the working class had nowhere else to go. They were wrong. Actually, the book should be retitled Wall Street's War on Workers and How the Democrats Enabled It. It's time to end the sad chapter in U.S. history when Democratic Party leaders refuse to be genuine allies for workers, and the Republican Party is rewarded for pretending to be. And if you're going to point out, as Sean Fain has, that Joe Biden actually joined a picking line and stood with the auto workers when they struck, well, that's true. But we can't forget the fact that he did side with the railroad workers, but sided with the railroad owners when they had their strike, which was very much a scandal at that time. Les says it's time to end this sad chapter in U.S. history when the Democratic Party leaders refuse to be genuine allies for workers, and the Republican Party is rewarded for pretending to be. By the way, Amazon is giving away the book. That's Les's book for $5.67 hardback, $5.67 for hardback or Kindle. All royalties go to the Labor Institute's Political Economy for Workers courses, one of which was conducted this year for Amazon workers who are struggling to form a union. So I just thought I would kind of put you in and make you aware of this stuff. Now I'm going to quickly share a third explanation. This piece was by Chuck Idelson on November 7, 2024. Why Democrats lose even when Republicans are so endlessly terrible. In large part, the campaign reflected the direction the Democratic Party establishment has taken away from working class issues since the advent of neoliberal policies in the 1970s and carried out by most Democratic Party presidents since. Amid the postmortems and reckonings that will now follow the wreckage of Donald Trump's return to, quote, absolute, unquote, power as authorized by the Supreme Court, there are two notes in particular that deserve a deeper dive. First, in Missouri, the show me state, a state Trump won by 58%. He won by 58%. He didn't get 58%. He won by 58%. I mean, I can't even imagine what percent of the vote Democrats got, in Missouri. But as he won by 58%, voters also acted to increase the minimum wage in the state to $15 an hour and to require employers to provide paid sick leave to workers. So the people voted for that. And Biden would not do everything he could to pass that $15 an hour through the Senate. He wouldn't do it. He respected the parliamentarian too much. And thereby he lost the election of 2024 early in 2021 when he made that particular bonehead play.
Explain what the parliamentarian really is.
Huh?
Explain what her job is.
Oh, her job is to advise the people in the Senate whether some particular provision of a reconciliation bill meets the standards for reconciliation. She's an advisor, a highly paid advisor. There is no reason to listen to her. Past administrations, past senators, in the Democratic Party felt free to just reject the recommendations of the advisor. Past administrations felt free to reject the advice of the parliamentarian, including both past Democratic administrations and past Republican administrations. But no, Joe Biden had to be a good boy and respect what the parliamentarian had to say. I really think he lost the 2024 election right then and there. If he had put in the $15 an hour, by the time of the election of 2024, those people would have been getting $15 an hour. And they would have been a hell of a lot happier. So anyway, they voted to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour in the state and to require employers to provide paid sick leave to workers. Proposition A was backed by unions and workers' advocacy groups, social justice and civil rights organizations, and even over 500 state business owners, despite the opposition of the Chamber of Commerce and so on. Here's something else. If you move to Nebraska, which is another red state won by Trump by large margins, I think he won by 18 points there, if I recall correctly. They passed a paid sick leave measure. That was Initiative 436. They passed it by 75%. It was overwhelmingly passed, in other words. Paid sick leave for Nebraskans, and other supporters noted that 250,000 Nebraskans were working full-time without paid sick days, especially in restaurants and other service jobs, construction, manufacturing, warehousing, retail, educational support, and transportation. By the way, did the workers in the state of Nevada, did they have paid sick leave? Do the restaurant workers there, the service workers there have paid sick leave? I don't know, but I really wonder whether they have it. Because maybe it's because they didn't have it. That might have been one reason why it's so close in Nevada right now. Quote, these are old school Democratic Party policy proposals that Republicans have actively voted against in D.C., but are hugely popular. Harris barely campaigned on them, despite progressives begging her to. Voters were clearly looking for solutions to their economic angst and agreed with Democrats on these policies, even if not associating those policies with Harris and her party, unquote. That's from ABC News correspondent Mary Alice Parks in a social media post. Second, in the multitude of exit poll results, one particularly stands out. 94% of registered Republicans, by the way, that's Liz Cheney and all her friends, 94% of them voted for Trump. I'm not saying Liz Cheney voted for Trump. I'm saying that she was probably among the 6% who didn't, but 94% of them still voted for Trump, which was the exact same percentage he received in 2020. So all the publicity about all the Republican defections didn't mean a damn thing. The heavy campaign focus on pulling away Republican voters from Trump turned out to be a pipe dream. Again, it was a pipe dream in 2020, but they tried it again. The old cliche, quote, it's the economy, stupid, unquote, that's James Carville, triumphed again. It was the major issue for many Joe Biden voters in 2020, who Vice President Kamala Harris lost in 2024. Much is written and said about Latino voters, but the Washington Post assessment seems right. 7 in 10 Latino voters nationally rated the economy as, quote, not so good, unquote, or poor, unquote, unquote, and a narrow majority supported Trump. 4 in 10 Latino voters termed the economy their top issue, and those chose Trump by a margin of 2-1. Okay, another Democratic that should cause concern are the youngest voters. Again, from the Post analysis, though voters under 30 supported Harris by 13 points in 2020, by 13 points in 2024. In 2020, Biden won that age group by a 24-point margin. So Harris underperformed Biden by 11 points with voters under 30. That is incredible. That is incredible. Let's say there had been a federal job guarantee in place at that point. At an average minimum wage across the country, cost adjusted, based on the CPI of the county the people are in. Let's say the average was $25 an hour. Do you think Harris's margin would have been only 13 points? You think those youngest voters don't have a terrible time finding a job? And when they do get one, that it's not at $7.25 an hour or $10 an hour or whatever? Some of the young people were certainly disaffected by the Biden-Harris administration's disastrous support for Israel's horrific war and ethnic cleansing against Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. But there are many indications that many more were discouraged by an economy of relentless high prices the past 4 years and by the difficulty in finding living wage jobs. How many of those do you suppose just stayed home because they didn't hear any promises from Harris about what she would do for them, and or because the Biden administration did nothing for them? Well, I guess that's all I'm going to cover, okay, of this particular piece. And once again, came from Common Dreams, and it was written by Chuck Idelson on November 7th, 2024. And one final thing that I want to mention, then I'm going to hightail it over to D's. But one other thing I want to mention is I find it so funny. I mean, I can't believe the stupidity of this putz. DNC Chair Jamie Harrison calls Sanders' critique of election loss, quote, straight up BS, unquote. So this is by Julia Connolly, and it's today. It's Julia Conley, actually. It's not Conley. After U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders offers his perspective on why Vice President Harris lost both the popular vote and electoral vote to Donald Trump in today's election, repeating his consistent warning the Democratic Party must center economic justice. Top official Jamie Harrison, he's the head of the DNC, signaled once again the party is unlikely to hear Harris's call. Harrison, the chair of the DNC and a former lobbyist for clients including Bank of America and BP, called Sanders' statement straight up BS and touted pro-worker policies embraced by the Biden administration, suggesting the party has sufficiently worked for economic justice and appearing to ignore all evidence that working-class voters gravitated towards Trump and the Republican Party. I want to recall to you that before he became the DNC chair, Jamie Harrison ran for the Senate in South Carolina. He was running opposite one of the most hated senators in the U.S. Senate, specifically Lindsey Graham. This jerk spent $120 million, or I should say, Chuck Schumer, maybe he was the jerk in this instance. No, Harrison's a jerk. But Chuck Schumer was also a jerk for spending $120 million on Jamie Harrison's campaign in South Carolina, seeking to beat Lindsey Graham. Guess what Graham's margin was over that idiot Jamie Harrison in 2022? Was it 2022 or 2020? I forget. It was the last time he ran. He spent $120 million and he lost by 60-40. Lost 60% to 40%. Lost in a landslide. Threw away $120 million. In the same year, the Democrats threw away something like $80 or $90 million in Kentucky on a fruitless race against Senator McConnell with an awful candidate. And they also threw away $110 million on a third race. I forgot what it was. But anyway, I'll never forget that Jamie Harrison spent $120 million and lost 60-40 to that absolute turd, specifically Lindsey Graham. How could you do that? Only because you never ran on a pro-worker platform. He didn't run on a pro-worker platform. That's how he spent $120 million of money that was needed elsewhere across the country by Democrats. And it was wasted on him. And then the reward he got after he lost, he was kicked upstairs to head the Democratic National Committee. Well, the article goes through the progressive things the Biden administration did. But as I said far earlier in this particular stream, it's not about being more progressive than other presidents have been for a long time. It's about actually meeting the needs of the people during the time when you are the president. If you fail to do that, it doesn't matter that you were a more progressive president than Obama, or than Clinton, okay, or than Jimmy Carter, or than any Democratic president since Lyndon Johnson. It doesn't matter a damn, because the fact is you left people unhappy. You left people thinking that you didn't do for them what they needed to have done. You didn't respond to the inflation by giving them an extra stimulus check and then going all out to stop the price gouging in the economy forthwith. You didn't do that. So you failed. You failed. And that was perhaps the most important reason. Well, you also failed on foreign policy. All those failures were the most important reasons why your vice president failed in her run for the presidency against Donald Trump. Anyway, folks, that's my analysis. Cora Emanuel says Kamala ran on nothing. People want change. She didn't offer any. When asked what she would do differently, she said not a thing comes to mind. Yeah, wasn't that stupid? Cara says anything she offered came with caveats. Check the final EC vote. Trump got 312 versus 226. Amazing. So in other words, Arizona was still outstanding. Also, Nevada was still outstanding when he was at 291. So he probably got both of those, right? Maybe there was even another state where it wasn't yet complete. He got 312 electoral votes. So that was more than Biden got in 2020 and more than Trump got in 2016. Okay, as well. So there's the final electoral college votes. But it was still close. It was still close. It wasn't a landslide. It wouldn't have been that hard to turn around if the Democrats had offered something. So on that note, I am going to say goodnight, and I'm going to go over to Dee's place. That is to say, I'm going over to Around the World, Dee and Friends. I hope you will join me there. I'm going to go over and help her out now for the rest of the night. I'll see you again on Saturday when most probably I'll be back to talking about international relations for the whole show. But for now, I'm going to end this stream.